Hey, everybody. Welcome to the second hour of the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today, a privilege. I want you to meet me on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Meet my morning stars there. And please go to the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. That's the only place where I can have friends. And I am on X at Santita J and the Santita Jackson Show. And I am now on Blue Sky, everybody, at santitajackson.bsky.social. It is, as of this recording, 55 years since the assassination of Fred Hampton. Really, I would say the spiritual head of the Black Panther Party. And we need to talk about his life, his legacy, and his assassination. Indeed, Defending Rights and Dissent have just won a lawsuit filed against the FBI to release and to receive more than 7,000 pages about the FBI informant who really gave the gave the police all the information they needed to kill him. They so far have a little bit more than 1,000 pages. They're waiting for the remaining 6,000. But it has been documented that the FBI were deep in the heart of this. But who was Fred Hampton? Every time your child gets a meal at school, breakfast or lunch, thank Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, who was also killed in the middle of the night. Because the school food program was started by this group of young people who had no money, but they had the intention of feeding people. They would walk the elderly to their bus stops. They would receive the elderly as they got off from work and make sure that they had safe passage home. There was so much that they did. There was so much love in the streets for the Black Panthers, and yet they were targeted for destruction. They were targeted for elimination by our government, and we need to talk about that. But I think you need to know who Fred Hampton was first. And in real time, he was a controversial figure. And I think it's important for us to say that. It's just like we look at Dr. King today and we say, oh, he's this beloved figure in many quarters, in most quarters. But in his lifetime, when he died, he was the most unpopular man in America. And Fred Hampton was in that space. And so I look at his friends, the people who loved him, the people who defended him. I have so much regard for them because they really were outliers in their time. And one of the heroes in my life and in your life too, as you know his story, is the great people's lawyer, Attorney G. Flint Taylor. Fred Hampton's lawyer, someone who staunchly defends him today, someone who loves him still. Indeed, uh, if you are in trouble, if you have to face the establishment today, you go to Attorney G. Flint Taylor. But I have to tell you, the original narrative of this story, um, it had to be no one who knew Fred Hampton believed that he and Mark Clark were engaged in a shootout. But most of the country did not know. So they believed the narrative passed out by the legacy media, by the corporate media, that these big, bad black guys in these leather jackets and berets and shades carrying guns, we just believed that they got into a shootout with the police. That wasn't so. And we would not have known that was so had Attorney G. Flint Taylor not gone to his apartment where Mark Clark had been executed in front of his pregnant fiancee, 8 months pregnant. We wouldn't have known the truth had he not had the courage to go there immediately following the assassination. So I'm so grateful to have him here with us today because indeed, you got to get his book. I want you to put it under your Christmas tree. We're at a time where people are asking a lot of questions. And this book, The Torture Machine by Attorney G. Flint Taylor, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago. I want you to get it. Racism and Police Violence in Chicago, The Torture Machine. The Torture Machine. Welcome back to the show, Attorney G. Flint Taylor. Thank you for all the work that you have done and that you do. December 4th, 1969. Take us back to that day. Number one, how did you get involved with Fred Hampton? What made you get involved with this man who so many people thought was a rabble rouser, but that was not what you saw?
Well, thank you for having me back, Santita, particularly on this memorable and very sad day, which is the December 4th of 55 years later after Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were assassinated. Your question about how I got involved, well, I was just about Fred Hampton's age. I was a couple of years older, had a very different background than he did. And I was in a law school at Northwestern, and I had become affiliated with several young lawyers who had been involved in representing the Black Panthers. And in so doing, they were also representing, of course, Fred Hampton. And so we became involved in representing him as he was railroaded to jail in early 69. And we then fought to get him out on an appeal bond. And we were successful, and Fred Hampton got back on the streets in mid August of 69. And at that time, we were not only representing Fred, but we were representing many of the Panthers who were being arrested for all sorts of alleged criminal activities, which were mostly trumped up. Everything from disorderly conduct for selling the Black Panther newspaper to attempted murder when they defended the Panther officers when the police attacked them. So we were very much involved. Myself as a law student and several lawyers and several other law students who had formed the People's Law Office in August of 1969. And so when the police came at 4:30 in the morning and raided the apartment and fired over 99 bullets into the apartment where Fred was sleeping along with the other young Panthers, after they left, Bobby Rush, who was the Minister of Defense of the Black Panther Party, called one of our lawyers, and we went to that apartment. And we spent the next 10 days taking evidence in that apartment, documenting what really had happened. And so that's how we got involved in the case, and that I personally got involved as well.
How were you able to get into the apartment? I mean, were
Well,
you, was
well
they,
yeah, that's an excellent question, and people always ask that. Why didn't the police do what you always see on the crime shows? Why didn't they take some yellow tape and seal it off and keep that murder scene away from the public? And I think there were a couple of reasons. They went at 4:30 in the morning, so it was close to dawn.
Mhm.
So by the time they finished their dirty business, the sun was starting to rise or was close to dawn. And so they were probably, on the one hand, extremely fearful that the community would rise up against them once they saw and understood what was happening. So they got out of there because their goal was to come back to the state's attorney's office, the chief prosecutor, Edward Hanrahan, and bring the guns they seized from the apartment, not to the crime lab, but rather to Hanrahan's office. So there was a combination of fear and arrogance. They felt that they would take those guns back to the state's attorney's office, they'd have a press conference, they'd show the guns, they'd talk about the vicious Black Panthers, what a horrendous shootout it was, and but for the grace of God, these cops would have been shot and killed, and that Fred Hampton was in the back bedroom waving a 45 caliber handgun. And that was the story that they brought to the media on the morning of December 4th. And so that's why they left it, for those two seemingly contradictory, but really two very uh, understandable from their point of view reasons, not understandable in any, from our point of view or from any reasonable person's point of view. But from ours, yeah. From theirs, yes.
I'm getting a little bit of background noise, and
You
I
want
apologize a little bit, but I'm going to, no, that's okay. If you can get that noise down just a little bit, so that we can hear you clearly. But we're talking with Attorney G. Flint Taylor on the 55th anniversary of the assassination of Chairman Fred Hampton, Chairman Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party. Indeed, if you read articles about him now, they say this was the first Rainbow Coalition. Indeed, in the last hour, we had George Bliss, who went to Proviso East High School. And those of us in the Chicagoland area know Proviso East as a very leave it to Beaver kind of setting. And that's where Fred Hampton came from. And as a member in his early organizing days of the NAACP, he organized white and black students at this school in 1966, 1967. And he brought together all of these people from different backgrounds so that they could have conversations and begin to work together in this moment. Many people don't know that about Fred Hampton, that he was someone who was beloved, he was approachable, and he had crossed racial lines, he had crossed class lines, and he talked about us all coming together. And so I want us to really dwell on that for a moment and look at this anti-establishment figure that he had been. It had really been put forward in the corporate media, Attorney Taylor, that he was this. I'm going to make sure we get that we don't have any background noise. But I mean, what was he like? I mean, before we get into how he was killed and all of that, just can't make us know him.
Well, he was a remarkable person. As I said, he was younger than I was, and I was basically a young kid at that time.
Because he was 22 when he was killed. Yes.
Younger than that, he was 20.
21?
I think he turned 21 in August of 1969,
Wow.
and he was brilliant. He was a fantastic speaker. He was a tremendous analyst for a young man of politics. And he was just dynamic. Everyone he came in contact with was really moved by him and by his not only his personality, but by his commitment to the movement and his commitment to against not only racism and white supremacy, but against imperialism and in fact he had a very socialistic approach economically, and he was very, very powerful in his call for resistance against police violence. So all of those aspects that he brought in one person and made him such a great leader and someone that everyone was totally taken with and wanted to follow him. That people would always say that he would never tell people to do anything that he wouldn't himself do. When you mentioned the Breakfast for Children program that the Panthers started. Now, he was the chairman of the Black Panther Party, but he would be there at the crack of dawn when they were getting the food ready for the children. Fred would be there. Fred would be there at the medical clinic as they were, putting the medical clinic together. He would be there and lead the political education classes that they had for new members of the Black Panther Party. So, and he would go. He could speak in a church where predominantly African American young people were, or he could speak, and I know this from personal experience also, in a law school where I went, where I had him come to speak, where it was not predominantly, almost exclusively white men back in those days, and from very upper class backgrounds by and large. And he could compel them to understand what he was talking about. So he was remarkable. I mean, he was a young version of a combination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. I don't think it's going too far to actually make those comparisons. And if you see the movie The Murder of Fred Hampton, which was made in 1971, there's remarkable footage of Fred speaking and of how powerful a speaker he was. I urge people to see that movie, and you get a real feel for Fred Hampton, not only Fred as a person, but Fred in the context of what the Panthers were about, and Fred in the context of what was happening in 1969 all around all of us who were trying to change the system at that point.
Well, you also saw in that movie his autopsy, at least at the beginning. I remember we hosted the movie at the Operation Push headquarters by that time. Because we wanted people to know, because we still had the FBI show on television, and people still believed that these were the good guys. And we see that Defending Rights and Dissent just won this lawsuit that they lodged against the FBI to get the documents of William O'Neill, the FBI informant embedded in the Black Panthers, who essentially gave Fred Hampton up.
Yes.
So, I mean, explain that. I mean, and why it is that only in 2024 they have been in a years-long battle to get some of this information. Who was William O'Neill? What's the problem with finding out who he was?
Well, many years ago, back in the 70s, we brought a lawsuit. And in fact, we were able to uncover a great number of FBI documents that dealt with William O'Neill. William O'Neill was an informant provocateur who was implanted in the Black Panther Party by the FBI and by the Racial Matters Squad within the FBI and within the super secret COINTELPRO program, which was a program that the FBI had in place, which was highly illegal and highly secret and was in place since the 30s, but was focused on the Black liberation movement in the 60s and ultimately on the Panthers and Fred Hampton and the Panther leadership. So in our litigation, we uncovered a great deal of FBI evidence concerning William O'Neill that had been suppressed. And that evidence included a floor plan that O'Neill had drawn for his control agent at the FBI, a floor plan which showed where Fred Hampton and would be sleeping at the time of the raid. And that information was given to the police and the state's attorneys who conducted the raid. And we also uncovered evidence that showed that the FBI claimed the raid as part of its COINTELPRO secret program. And ultimately, we also obtained evidence that showed that William O'Neill was given a bonus, a $300 bonus for making the raid a success. And that bonus came straight from Washington and from J. Edgar Hoover's desk. All of that was part of the lawsuit back in the 70s. So a great deal of the O'Neill information came out in the 70s and made what was part and parcel of our ability to show that the FBI's COINTELPRO program was in fact behind and a motivating force for the assassination, the political assassination of Fred Hampton.
Did that come out at that time?
Yes, all of that came out. I'm interested to see if this FOIA gets anything new, because we certainly got a great deal of information. We got 200 volumes of FBI files, and that wasn't just handed over to us. That was, in fact, hidden from us until it was exposed during our trial, and the evidence was produced. And among that evidence were some number, I can't remember the exact number, maybe 15 or 16 files that of William O'Neill evidence. So this may be, the FOIA may get, again, some of these files that we were able to obtain back in the day. But in any event, we're talking about, the bottom line here is that it's been established that there was a FBI conspiracy that went hand in glove with Edward Hanrahan, the state's attorney of Cook County, and the Chicago police to assassinate Fred Hampton and to murder Mark Clark.
Well, I continue to ask these questions because we're still asking questions about RFK Jr., a senior. I had Lisa Peace, one of his chief investigators. Her book is "A Lie Too Big to Fail," the true history of the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and to see the involvement of the CIA and the FBI, and to see how the lies are proliferated. Sirhan was standing in front of him. The kill shot for Robert Kennedy was behind his head. And all the pictures you see are of him bleeding from behind, not from the front. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Nothing about everything about his murder from my father and mother and a few other people who survived all of that. They said, when he came out against the Vietnam War, the harassment was just unbelievable. He said we had already lived under threat, but he was killed, Attorney G. Flint Taylor, a year to the day to the minute that he announced his opposition to the Vietnam War at the Riverside Church. Malcolm X's daughters are suing the FBI and the CIA. They want to know what, and the NYPD, they said, we know you're involved. We want to know, we need to know what happened. What happened? And so I continue to ask you about I continue to ask you about William O'Neill and the FBI, because I want people to, I want people to know just the scope of what you've been dealing with, what you had to go up against as a lawyer, and the infiltration that still happens in movements today. People need to understand that, the CIA came up with the term conspiracy theorist. So you won't speculate. So you'll just buy, the legacy media's narrative. If we bought the legacy media's narrative, we would have thought it was a shootout and we would have kept on moving. That's not what happened.
Well, that's absolutely true. And it's important that you brought up the Malcolm X case, because I have been honored by being one of the lawyers, along with Ben Crump and Jonathan Moore in New York, in filing that lawsuit for the family of Malcolm X. And there's so many left unanswered questions in the Malcolm X case. And there's so many FBI files that were suppressed all these years. And the questions arise as to, there were at least 9 informants in the ballroom, FBI informants,
9
in the ballroom during the assassination. And J. Edgar Hoover ordered the FBI not to reveal those witnesses. They were witnesses, at least, if not people who actually took part in the assassination. And for decades and decades, those files had been kept secret. And so that's one of the objects of the lawsuit that we all have brought on behalf of the family, is to pry open those files and find out if any of the assassins were in fact FBI informants. And in fact, one of them, who wielded the shotgun, had very close contact with the FBI. And it appears that the FBI had a file on him, and it appears that he got some very lenient treatment in a case, in an armed robbery case, a bank robbery case that he was involved in. And somebody passed the judge a note, and all of a sudden he walked free, and his co-defendant got a 25-year sentence. So the question becomes whether this man, by the name of William Bradley, who fired the shotgun that ripped Malcolm X's body apart, was in fact an FBI informant, either at the time or subsequently to the assassination of Malcolm. And of course, we have all of the fingerprints of the COINTELPRO program on Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad back in the early 60s, way before the program focused on Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers, and the program focused on Dr. King. So in a way, not more, when we're looking at the Malcolm X case, we're actually looking at a case and a conspiracy and a cover-up that occurred years before the assassination of Fred Hampton. And as of yet, we don't have the floor plan document or the bonus document or anything that directly links the FBI in the same way that the Hampton case does. But that doesn't mean that it isn't out there to be found if it hasn't been destroyed at this point.
Do you think that knowing in real time, did you have the sensibility that you were being infiltrated by the FBI, that Fred Hampton's organization was being infiltrated to this at all, particularly to this extent?
Well, I have to lean on what the Panthers said at that time. And the Panthers clearly understood that they were being infiltrated. Mm-hmm. They just didn't know who it was. Mm-hmm. And one of the whole purposes of the COINTELPRO program was to put what they called snitch jackets on people. And so they would try to make people, the Panthers, think that certain people were informants who weren't, and then the informants who were would have more cover. And so it would make all this paranoia in the organization, which already felt very unsafe because they knew they were being infiltrated. Now, at the time of the assassination, there was no document. None of these FBI documents obviously were public, but there was an understanding among the Panthers, and Bobby Rush in particular spoke of it right after the assassination, that this was an FBI program that was designed to wipe out the Panthers. Mm-hmm. But at that point, it was a statement that was believable but wasn't documented. And what we and all of the folks did in the next 5 to 10 years, and, the hearings in Washington, the Watergate hearings, the Church Committee hearings, our litigation, was to uncover a large portion of that evidence about COINTELPRO, about the targeting of Malcolm X and Dr. King, and of course of the Panthers. So there was, in '69, it was a belief, but it was proven all to be true in the next few years.
We're talking with Attorney G. Flint Taylor, Fred Hampton's lawyer. Indeed, he's been working with the family now for almost 60 years. It's the 55th anniversary of the assassination of Mark Clark and Fred Hampton. We don't talk about Mark Clark enough. He's almost like the forgotten victim here. Who was he?
Well, Mark Clark was another young Panther. He was a leader in Peoria, Illinois, of a small chapter in Peoria. He had come to Chicago only weeks before, and he happened to be in the apartment working security that night. What's really striking about the Panthers who were in that apartment, I mentioned how young Fred Hampton was, but he wasn't the youngest person in that apartment. There were two young women, both very diminutive in size. At that point, she went by the name of Brenda Harris, and the other young woman, Verlina Brewer, was 17. Brenda was 18. And they were both shot and seriously wounded. Doc Satchel, he had the name Doc because he was involved in the medical clinic and was very involved in the medical part of the Panthers. He was shot 5 times. He was asleep in the middle bedroom. And of course, Deborah Johnson now goes by the name of Akua Najiri. She was 8.5 months pregnant with Fred and her son, Fred Jr. at the time. And so, yes, that and what people may not understand about the Panthers was as committed as they were and as vigilant as they were also very young and idealistic, and they were very much committed to the movement. But if you're 18 years old and you're thinking of joining the Black Panther Party, and you see that these young people were shot in their beds and their leader was assassinated with bullets in his head, that was, shall we say, a bit of a deterrent to be a great understatement to organizing people to the Black Panther Party, which of course was a major reason that they did this attack. They wanted to wipe out the Black Panthers.
Well, that's why I wanted to find out how you were able to walk up on this apartment. It's an apartment in a building, and I know I've been there. I went there as a little girl. My father had us stay outside, but he wanted people to see
Mm-hmm.
this place. And I remember us going there, and he left us outside because I was about 7. And when you, I'm struck by the fact that even then you could walk up on the place. I mean, looking back, and this was the place where people were murdered, which is that's the ultimate sin. I mean, not that sin can be placed in a hierarchy, but thou shalt not kill. It's, and I'm wondering, and I'm believing that this was leaving this death scene open was a signal to the community that this too could happen to you, because it didn't feel like it was sealed off, or it just felt like the police wanted people to see that this is where the night they brought old Dixie down, the night they brought Fred Hampton and Mark Clark down. This is what can happen to you when you leave a place open like that.
Well, I hadn't really thought about it in that way. But if that was their intent, it certainly backfired on them in the sense of their lie being exposed, and the fact that they, on the one hand, they wanted to have a justification publicly for what they did, and they couldn't really justify it if, in fact, this murder scene were left open. So, in that sense, that was a huge mistake.
Mm-hmm.
But in the sense that you're talking about, I'm not sure they really. We should give them that much credit, actually.
Mm-hmm.
That they were thinking, well, we'll leave it open so people can see it. But maybe.
Well, because I think it's a spiritual death, and I know how it's interesting. Newsweek, when their edition on Dr. King's assassination did not have him speaking at the March on Washington or marching. They had a black woman an old black woman with a scarf on in a wool coat, and you saw her screaming in pain and in anguish, and you saw Dr. King in the casket in the background. I said, this is interesting that they wanted us to see they wanted us to believe that the movement was dead. I mean, because I think of just as an artist and also as someone who watches, I'm in media, and they purposefully shape a narrative for you. Like they shaped a narrative for you that night or that morning this was a shootout, but you knowing them said this did not happen. What did happen that night?
Well, as I alluded to, that they 14 highly trained killers, many of whom were very skilled in terms of what they were there to do, went there with machine guns, shotguns, handguns, with the layout of the apartment. Went there under the color of darkness because did not, bring tear gas. Did not go at a time where they could tell the people to come out and then arrest them if they had, for the possession of illegal guns, if there were any there. But instead they broke in the front and the back doors, fired the machine gun, about 40 or 45 bullets into the little walls, the plaster walls of that apartment, came in the back where Fred Hampton was sleeping. And we later were able to develop evidence that Fred had been drugged. And that was why he was laying in his bed asleep when they put the bullets into his head during the raid. And as I said before, Fred Hampton would not. He would do, if he told somebody to do something, he would be the first person to do it as well. So it was very hard for people to understand why Fred wouldn't have defended himself if the police came busting into the apartment. And the only rationale was, and it turned out that there was evidence to support it, that he'd been drugged. And that made it easier for them to kill him. But 99 bullets were fired into that apartment. The Panthers fired one bullet, and that probably was fired by Mark Clark as he was shot in the heart, and he had a gun, and the bullet seemed to go in a direction upwards, he might have been falling back at the time he was shot. That was the only evidence of any firing by the Panthers. And as I said, that it was close to 100 shots fired by the police. And you have to understand, this is a tiny apartment. This you could fit the entire apartment into some big rooms in a hotel or something. That's what happened. In 15 minutes. Raid. It was later described by the NAACP and Ramsey Clark in a report as search and destroy mission. And as I said, over the years and decades, the narrative changed thanks to the community, thanks to the Panthers, and thanks to the legal community. Changed that narrative from a shootout to a shoot-in, to a murder, to an assassination. And what we're doing today as we talk and we recount what happened 55 years ago is we're defending that narrative. Because if we don't defend that narrative and spread that narrative and educate around that narrative, that the people in power are going to try to change it back to a shootout. They're going to try to bring forward that lie again, because that's what they do.
Was anyone ever punished, held responsible for his murder or his assassination, or did this team of executioners, were they able to walk free?
Well, we put him on trial for 18 months, but it was a civil case. And so they weren't going to go to jail if and when we won that case. And ultimately in 1983, we were able to, after going all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and having an 18-month trial, we were able to get a settlement for the families. But to answer your question about, I can only quote Mrs. Hampton and Iberia Hampton, a wonderful woman. And
his mother.
you knew her, I'm sure.
Yes.
And she went to court with us for every day for 18 months and heard the slings and arrows that the defense was throwing at Fred Hampton and the slander. And she was just a strong and wonderful woman. But her greatest regret in all of it was she said none of them ever did a day in jail.
Mm.
None of those cops, not Hanrahan, they were put on trial at one point by a special prosecutor here in Chicago, but not for murder, not for attempted murder, but for obstruction of justice. And the fix was in during that case. It went to trial in 1972. Hanrahan was standing for re-election in the state's attorney's race. It went in front of a judge that was connected to the machine, the Democratic machine, very close to the mayor. That was Richard J. Daley. And right on cue, after 3 months of evidence that was put on of cover-up, obstruction of justice, this judge granted an acquittal to all of the defendants, including Hanrahan. And so Daley and all of them in Hanrahan were thrilled because they could then turn to the electorate and say, look, I was exonerated. There's nothing here. Vote for me. But as you know, Santita, there was a great deal of organizing, and your father was one of the organizers, certainly, of a movement, particularly in the African American community, to come forward and to cross over and vote for a moderate Republican and vote Hanrahan out of office. And so less than a month after this ridiculously unfair verdict by the judge, the community gave its verdict and voted Hanrahan out of office. And that movement, as you know, led to the election of Harold Washington a decade later. And some people even trace it all the way to Obama. But in any event, it was a remarkable expression of the community and the community's feeling about the guilt or innocence of Edward V. Hanrahan and the raiders who went to that apartment that night.
Well, indeed, it took so much organizing because people had to continue to organize. We were meeting at Operation Breadbasket and Rainbow and then Operation Push every Saturday. You had to have a sustained movement to continue to chip away at this because I don't think that people have the real understanding, the sense of the power of the Democratic machine in Chicago. Um, because this could happen in Chicago because Richard J. Daley was all powerful. The Democratic Party was organized down to the block. So people don't realize how boxed in we were and how we had to have a Senator Chuck Percy, who was a moderate Republican, who would help us. We had to work with Republicans because they were the ones who were going to help us. It was the Democrats who were keeping us locked in, and indeed, it was Democrats who signed off on this man's murder. So I want to find out from you because this is power, everybody. So before people come in and say that I'm anti-democrat, I'm anti-injustice, however it manifests and wherever it manifests, upon whomever it visits. And I think that's why we're examining this today. Because 55 years later, there are still questions. 55 years later, we are still trying to get the documents that evidence the complicity of the FBI and others in the killing of this man, these men, the near deaths of their colleagues. We need to talk about that. I mean, because people try to dismiss uh, this story as a conspiracy. And I want to know from you, just given the work that you've done nationally, but particularly in Chicago, because I've seen so much of your work, particularly with John Burge, Lieutenant Commander, who oversaw the torture of a generation, at least, of young Black boys, youth, Black men, young Black men, just horrific. Your book is The Torture Machine: Racism and police violence in Chicago. Is there a tie? Is there a line from what happened with, Dr. King being struck by the rock in Gage Park, and on and on and on it went? The harassment that African Americans and Black people have had to endure in Chicago, and the murder of Fred Hampton. Someone from the Red Squad was sent to kill my father, the same kind of informant who, was outed, and he told us his whole story. It sounds so much like what happened to Fred Hampton. Is there a line that takes us to the Burge tortures and Holman Square, this place that looks like that was modeled on a CIA uh, site where you just disappear people? What is going on in Chicago? Is there a line here, or are these just isolated incidents just that happened all over the place?
Oh, definitely not isolated incidents. There definitely is a culture of police violence, of white supremacy that has come down from the beginning of policing in the city, but has really manifested itself in the assassination of Fred Hampton, and again in 35 years of police torture that was masterminded by John Burge and covered up by the younger Daley, among others, who was the prosecutor in the 80s when a lot of this was going on, and then became the mayor when a lot of this was becoming uncovered. I would. You mentioned also about the machine and the Democrats and how powerful they were. I just finished a draft of a second book, Santita. Santana,
I'll
the
take
musician.
Carlos Santana any day. Love it.
Getting late. And but this book is called Prosecutors, Politicians, and Police Violence: A Chicago Story, and it looks in great depth into Hanrahan and all the politics that happened from just before the assassination. Hanrahan, of course, becomes the state's attorney in early 69, late 68. Fred and Mark are assassinated at the end of 69. And then it goes on intensely for 3 years until, as I mentioned, that Hanrahan is voted out of office. And the involvement of Daley Sr. and all of the politicians and the rise of Ralph Metcalf on the South Side and his declaration that it's never too late to be black, and his turning against the machine, and your father's involvement, and so many others who, it started out as a small movement with Ralph Newhouse running for mayor and getting like 8% of the vote, but people continued to organize and it's all very, very interesting, but it's all really talks about the machine and its connection to police violence, and the machine and its connection to prosecutors, and particularly to Hanrahan, and then later to Richard M. Daley. And so it's quite a story.
Why is the Fred Hampton story why is the story of his assassination, why is that so resonant? Why is that so important today?
Well, I think it's because of what it has meant and what it continues to mean to people of conscience, and particularly to people in the African American and communities of color, because it resonates in terms of the experiences that people have had with the police. Not everyone is assassinated, but most everyone has had some kind of negative, racially motivated experience with the police or with the democratic machine. So the fact that it is such a seminal type of case, not only here in the city, but as we've talked about, it's the one case where it has been definitively proven by the government's own documents that there was a conspiracy that came out of Washington, came out of the FBI, and that the local police and the prosecutors worked hand in glove with that. That kind of broad-based conspiracy. These days the right wing has fanciful conspiracies, right, around every corner. But we here uh, have an actual conspiracy that was focused against the Black liberation movement in general and Black leadership in particular. That's a true conspiracy, not a conspiracy based on lies, but a conspiracy that is proven as true.
We have so much, there's so much more to say, and I want everyone to get The Torture Machine, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago. You need to read it, and I cannot wait for your new book to come out. But I'd like to give you the floor, Attorney G. Flint Taylor. But before I do, I want to thank you for all of your work. You have been a freedom fighter for going on 6 decades now. And we are so grateful that we know that we can come to you when we're in trouble. Um, and we know that you will fight for us with all of your might. And I just want to thank you for that. What has been left unsaid about Fred Hampton, about Mark Clark, about what happened to them, and about their legacy?
Well, of course, as you said, we could go on much longer to talk about who those wonderful young men were, who, as well as the wonderful young women and men who made up the Black Panther Party and were also in that apartment, many of them. Uh, their legacy lives on, as you mentioned, and not only in the breakfast program that now the children in schools in the city have, that was initiated by the Panthers. Other programs, the kinds of uh, things that the Panthers talked about and advocated for. They advocated against imperialism and unjust wars like the war in Vietnam. They advocated against prisons and unjust prisons, which is now obviously still a major movement and issue in this country. So the legacy of the Panthers and the legacy of Fred Hampton, Mark Clark, and all of those young folks lives on today. And I think it lives on in what we see taking in different forms, the movements that we all try to support today, whether it's the movement for Black Lives, the movements against all various forms of oppression and repression in this country. So hopefully that those movements will grow. They'll have to grow in resistance to what is impending on the horizon with the Trump administration and the kind of repression and reprisals that he is fomenting in what seems to me to be kind of, not kind of, but an actual neo-fascist way.
Hmm. Attorney G. Flint Taylor, Fred Hampton's defender and brother beloved, and Mark Clark. We remember them both. We remember them all. We just thank God for their work and for their example. We thank you for yours. Everyone, please get The Torture Machine, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago. I would dare say, Attorney G. Flint Taylor, this is evidence of that book. Uh, and so I want you to get it because you're not a conspiracist, everybody. This really did happen. And if we really examine this, we can ensure that it never happens again. And David Thornton says, rest in power, Chairman Fred Hampton. Rest in power, Comrade Mark Clark. Rest in power, Huey Newton. Rest in power, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Rest in power, Mahatma Gandhi. Rest in power, so many people, John Brown, so many people who have really fought the good fight for freedom, and it does continue. And victory is certain if you continue with the struggle, everybody. Remember that. Thank you, Attorney G. Fleck Taylor. I got you. It's all right. It's just people. Sending you so much love, Attorney G. Fleck Taylor. And
Bringing it right back at you. And
absolutely. Thank you for all of your work. Sending you so much. God bless you. Have a great one.
take care.